very honored today to have a longtime friend come to give us our seminar, Professor retired Chet Kyle. He was a professor at Cal State Long Beach for a long time. When we first met, we were trying to decide when it was, sometime in the early 80s. And ever since, anytime I have a question, especially about bicycles, I call Chet. And Chet always has the answer. So he's got data. Most recently, we were interested in tire force data for bicycles. I thought, who in the world could have that? And it turns out that Chet indeed had it. It was out somewhere stored in the back, and it took him about a day to dig down to where it was, but he eventually got it back to us, and so we had the answer. Chet has an amazing history of interesting projects, including building the first fared bicycle in the United States. I don't want to steal his thunder. He's worked on lots of other interesting projects too. The neat thing, and the reason that this talk is so appropriate today is because, as some of you may know, May is Bike Month. So anybody who doesn't ride a bike should be riding a bike this month. And so Chet's going to tell us a little bit about bikes, but also about solar cars and human-powered aircraft and whatever else he wants to. So here's our speaker, Chet Kyle.
We have some famous people in the audience. We have Maureen Hall, who I think you won the Davis Double Century, didn't you? One time? I think you did. This guy's I got a laser pointer. He's a real bike rider. He's one of these pseudo bike riders like me. Oh, turn the microphone on, yes. Let's see. Turn the microphone on. Do I have it? Is that on? That's on. Can everybody hear me okay? You guys have got great hearing. I can't hear you at all.
I don't think our camera will
Switch. There are two switches there.
But can I see your mic and we'll make sure that both
there you go.
I think we're ready?
Okay, we're ready. Thanks for inviting me, Maud. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the hospitality. That's wonderful. What we're going to talk about, Maud just said, talk about something that you've done and include a little bit of data, or some data. So that's what we'll do. We're going to talk about experiments with bicycles that are economic, and they were extremely effective. They got a lot done, and mostly what I've done was a matter of chance, luck, whatever you want to call it. Students, I can't take credit for all this stuff. In fact, very little of it. A lot of it was the idea of students. So let's you know about the history of bicycles, but let me review a little bit. The first modern bicycle was called a safety bicycle, and the Starley brothers of England introduced this, and it was, you didn't fall over on your head when you used one of these things. The third model actually looks almost like a modern bicycle, except didn't have a seat tube, and by 1890 there you have something you can probably buy in Holland today. It had brakes, it had chain drive, it had fenders, it had the double diamond frame and everything. So we'll talk about why modern bicycles look almost identical to this one later on. The bicycle was the king of the road from 1890 to 1905. It was the fastest thing on the road. Bicycle racers were national heroes, and they were revered by people, and it didn't take them long to discover that wind resistance was the major force retarding the progress of a bicycle. So how do you cut wind resistance? The first thing they discovered was drafting. They had these enormous 5-man bicycles. The Dunlop Tire Company employed squads of professional bicycle racers to pace this guy, to set speed records, to set point-to-point records. They could go 35 miles an hour or so if this fellow could average that for long distances by riding behind, drafting behind these racers. And of course, they still do it today. Most of the data, by the way, in this talk Most of the data was generated either by me, by students, by colleagues, and so all the data is ours, by the way. We put SRM power meters. This is a 1996 USA four-man pursuit team, and to go with us 37 miles an hour. And to go 37 miles an hour takes about 600 watts for this guy, but the second man back is 430 watts, and if you look at percentage, 171, you get back to there, it's only 60%, and that's power. That's not drag, that's power. So naturally, it's better to draft than go out in front. And the other ways of drafting would be in 1894, they had a windshield which cut wind resistance. That cuts it about 20 to 30%. And this one, to go to extreme, the first motorcycles ever developed were developed to pace bicycles, believe it or not. They still have cranks on them, they still have pedals, and they have this enormous IC engine there. It could go 55 miles an hour, and this guy's drafting behind a windshield, and he can go 55 miles an hour. That was kind of something. If you really want to get extreme about it, you go to the Demontville Salt Flats, a flat, hard surface, absolutely dead level, and my friend Alan Abbott went 140 miles an hour behind his brother's race car. He had the highest speed bicycle crash in history. He ran into the back of this car at 140 miles an hour, got flipped down into the windstream, and he didn't go down, he was just stopped in a hurry. John Howard from USA went 152 miles an hour, and the present record is almost 167 miles an hour. So that's the way to go if you want to pedal. These things are pedaled, they're not attached in any way to this. Notice this is motorcycle technology. The head angle, this enormous sprocket, pin chain, industrial pin chain. This one is a double reduction, but the guy that designed this, Doug Malowicki, copied Alan Abbott's design except for the double reduction gears there. Really neat. Decreased frontal area is another way to cut wind resistance. You want to go faster? Lean over like this. And you think drop bars are new? Forget it. 1894 they had drop bars. The first real change in drop bars occurred nearly 100 years later. And Pete Benceres, who is a Race Across America Ram rider, still holds the record for the Ram. He averaged 15.7 miles an hour crossing from the west coast to the east coast, and he leaned his elbows against this. That's the first set of aero bars. He asked me to build them, so I did, and that's what they look like at Cal State Long Beach. The reason that you can go faster and longer, of course, is you don't have to support the weight of your body with your hands, and so it takes less energy to use aero bars. The positions that Maury Hull is familiar with, having won the Davis double century, would be this one, where you use drop bars. Aero bars were introduced in 1986. An engineer, Graham O'Brien of Scotland, an amateur bicycle rider, broke the world hour record as an amateur by using this position. He invented this, which really has a low drag, and of course the professional bicycle racers were outraged. They couldn't stand it that an amateur had broken the record, so the official governing agency, the UCI, Union Ciclista Internacional, they said, that's illegal, you can't do that. And so they said, you can't do that, Graham O'Brien. In the meantime, in between these two positions, somebody else broke the world hour record using Graham O'Brien's position. But he said, okay, it's illegal, and he invented another one which is better, called the Superman position, which is the diving position, and this one is really fast. So Graham O'Brien broke the world hour record twice, the most famous record in cycling lore. Another way of decreasing frontal area is a recumbent. You've seen them around UC Davis. They ride in a nice, easy chair posture. This guy was a second category rider in Europe, named Francis Faure, I guess. And he was beating all of the standard bicycle racers in Europe using this bicycle. Guess what the UCI did in this case? You'll be happy to know that this is not a bicycle by official ruling in 1933 of the UCI. That is not a bicycle, and therefore you've never seen one in a bicycle race, a standard bicycle race, and to this day they're illegal. So that's why that's basically the reason why the modern bicycle looks like it did in 1890. Because that is not a bicycle. Okay. You think streamlining is modern? Forget that one too. Disc wheels, 1894. That's in Sharp, a book called Sharp. They put streamlined fairings around bicycles in 1911. This guy got a patent on it. This guy's name is Bono Faria. He got a patent on this design, and they had a bicycle race in Berlin. Notice the disc wheels? They had a bicycle race in Berlin in 1914. Now, we had no idea about this. We don't pay any attention to what goes on in Europe. You know that. Europe is a foreign country. But we decided at Cal State Long Beach that we had to verify this famous equation, drag is a half rho times CdA times v squared, to see whether it was really proportional to the velocity squared. So a couple students of mine went down to UC Irvine and measured a cylinder in the wind tunnel. Now, I'll be darned if it isn't. You sort of fit a third order curve to this thing, and you get a reliability coefficient of 0.9997. It works. It's actually velocity squared, so good. We can go on from there. Viscous shear, this is form drag. It's purely if you integrate the pressure over the surface of a cylinder, you get the drag, and it's practically 100% of the drag. Friction drag, which is viscous shear like this, is usually a very small part of the drag on bluff bodies, like cylinders, and like the human form. Human form's got cylinders here, cylinders there, ovals, so you can sort of forget viscous shear. It's very important in causing a transition from laminar to turbulent flow, which we'll see later on. How do you measure drag? Well, you can use a wind tunnel. That's a neat way, probably the best. You can use an automotive coast down on a vehicle. You can coast a vehicle on a smooth surface or any surface you want as long as it's level, and measure the velocity or the rate at which it slows down. You can try to tow it, and they actually do measure drag by using a water tow tank. You can do it by computation. Terminal velocity is a neat way to measure drag. That's a great way. You take and drop it from an airplane and see what its terminal velocity is, and you can calculate the drag. Now, if you could just drop a bicycle from an airplane, you'd be able to measure its drag, see? But that's not a very good way to do it unless you have a parachute. So I got a couple students in 1972. This is quite a while. Now, I'd like to tell you what it was like in 1972 in a university. First of all, they didn't ordinarily have any departments, any place in the United States that discussed sports equipment, that discussed biomechanics. There are very few biomechanics programs. What they were interested in is physiology, which is how much oxygen uptake there is, what the motion of the limbs are, and that sort of thing. Sports science was just starting. The Cold War was going on. It was in full-blown Cold War at that time. We were competing with the East Germans. The East Germans and the Russians were starting to use sports science and perhaps chemicals to improve the performance of their athletes. And so it was wide open in 1972, the area of sports science. And little things you did with just a little bicycle or whatever you want to do, you could get a lot of recognition for doing things like that, as you'll see. So these guys wanted to know what was the best tire, whether it's a clincher tire or whether it was a sew-up tire. That's all they wanted to know. So they came to me and asked if we could figure that out. So we put a few timing switches on a smooth surface, and we had them coast through the, using a coast down test, coast through the thing, and by measuring the rate at which it slowed down, we could tell what the drag on the object was using Newton's law. By the way, I just saw in addition to Newton's Principia Mathematica about an hour ago. Boy, what an experience! That was something. He collects books. Don't tell anybody. Anyway, this is the way to do it. You find out that if you write Newton's law in this form, which is dv dx dx dt, that it's a straight line. But you go through this thing, and the decrease in velocity with respect to position is a straight line, almost exactly a straight line. So that's the way you figure drag using a coast down test. And these students, Durand Noto and Claude Crawford, actually did that, and they found out that sure enough, sew-up tires are better than a clincher. They still are. They found out there was no difference between a cheap 10-speed and an expensive racing bicycle. The difference was the tires. They also found that wind resistance was an enormous part of the resistance against the bicycle. And they thought about it and said, well, gee, why don't we make an aero bicycle? They actually called this an aero bike at the time. And that's what I say, whatever happened to me is a kind of chance. I got my job at Cal State Long Beach because a friend of mine refused the job. I got started in this because of these two students, Crawford and Nato, and seemed like everything I've done is because of someone else, but that's okay. These guys found with their aero bicycle, they put plastic on the wheels and they covered the frame with plastic. They called it an aero bike, and it starts out here and it comes out there. They got an 8% decrease in wind resistance just by covering the wheels and the frame with, so pretty clever, right? That was probably the first aero bike ever built in the United States by a couple of mechanical engineering students. But we figured the way that cyclists can use the information, we thought this was neat information. You ought to publish it in a popular journal. We did all sorts of the scientific journal stuff too, but popular journals, people actually read it and actually learn about it. So we the three of us, published something in bicycling. What's the effect of hills? What are the effect of weight? What's the effect of air resistance, of body position, and all sorts of other things they mentioned. And so that was published in Bicycling in 1973, 74. They graduated, as students often do, frequently do. And the trouble is with graduating students is, heck, you don't work for you anymore, and that's not good for professors, so you got to get new students, you know. But I figured that, well, gee, wind resistance is so big, they streamlined motorcycles, automobiles, airplanes. Why not streamline a bicycle? So had some old used aluminum tubing in laboratory and bent it around a NACA wing profile, made a covering or a framework that goes around a bicycle. My heat transfer students wanted to know whether I could ride it or not, so I climbed in and rode it. Unfortunately, I made a mistake and fell over, but they get a big kick out of that. They're pulling me out. My wife Joyce, who's in the audience, hello Joyce. She actually covered this framework with Cadet, which is an aircraft fabric. You can iron it on and it gets a really smooth surface. We ended up working in the hallway, and both Crawford and myself worked in the hallway. It's an 1/8 of a mile long hallway in the gymnasium at Cal State Long Beach. You can go 30 miles an hour down the middle of the hallway, and it's pretty scary because they got glass doors at the end. And so we put skid marks on the end of the hallway way down there, and the janitors were not happy about that, so we had to scrub up the skid marks after every test. It was to give you an idea of chance, luck, happenstance, serendipity, I don't care what you want to call it. this guy's Jack Lambie, and Lambie reinstituted the sport of hang gliding in the U.S. He built the first hang glider since the days of Lilienthal, and tried it out, and he wrote an article for an aircraft magazine and gave the plans. So this is Jack Lambie. He's rather well known in gliding circles. I went to an American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics meeting on race cars, and I heard somebody talking behind me that said he was building a streamlined bicycle. So I turned around, it was Jack Lambie. So I invited him to come to Cal State Long Beach, and this is his idea of a streamlined bicycle, and that was mine. The first guy that showed up was a small little guy who asked some very intelligent questions. That happened to be his boss, who's Paul McCready, who won the Kramer Prize and a few other things in the meantime. Anyway, so some of my students at Paul van Valkenburg thought this is the way to make a fairing. You just cover yourself up with this, and he made one that was made out of plastic blow-up, and if you fall off, you bounce. This is my son Scott. Rex Winkle, another student, built this recumbent tricycle, put a fairing around it, and we measured the drag of these in the hallway. And it's just to go into a little detail, this is a standard bicycle with a guy in touring position. You put this around and it drops it to there. The Rex Winkle tricycle was slightly lower than that. The fairing, if you put a fairing on the Rex Winkle, is slightly lower yet. Lambie's Streamliner was there, and mine, because it had a longer profile, is down there. So we figured, man, look at all the energy you can save by doing this. It ought to really go fast. So I went to a bicycle company, Teledyne, and I said, hey, why don't we try breaking some records with this thing? So we published all of that data in Bicycling Magazine again. It says, streamlined bicycles, are they in your future? But that's kind of a prediction. It turned out to be correct. Barry Harvey, who was the designer of the Teledyne Titan bicycle, is in the thing, trying the thing out. He was pretty well impressed. So he got his sponsored rider, Ron Scarron, who, by the way, is in the Hall of Fame. Ron Scarron is. They got him to ride it, and we issued a kind of a handwritten press release that said we were intending on the Alamitos Air Base, intending to break all the bicycle speed records between 0 and a mile. So we actually did. Ron Scarron broke every speed record, standard bicycle speed record, between 0 and a mile. He went over 40 miles an hour for a mile. The record with a standard bike is about 36 miles an hour. So anyway, the publicity, there was nothing doing. There was no X Games. There were no television programs on weird sports. Nothing happening. So they reported this. We got a bunch of reporters. They reported all the way Hong Kong, South Africa, England, Germany. The publicity on this was unbelievable. So that's what started the Streamlined Bicycle thing. And Lambie and myself decided to hold a race. So we invited a bunch of people to have a race. The first Streamlined Bicycle race since 1913. Then it was at Irwindale quarter-mile drag strip. Alan Abbott, who's the guy that had the high-speed dragster on the salt flats, Alan Abbott had this. His nose is about 6 inches away from the wheel and about a foot off the ground. That didn't seem too safe to me. Glenn Brown had a low recumbent. Another guy in the Bicycle Hall of Fame is Victor Vincenti. He showed up with this thing called a Tachi Taxi. And T-A-T-H-I, I think in Greek, means speed. So this is really clever. I mean, you lean on the thing, and it steers like a skateboard. You lean right, it goes right, maybe, and you lean left, and it goes left. He's got hand cranks and an enormous sprocket up here. And over 40 miles an hour, something went wrong with the skateboard bit of it, and he crashed, and it crumpled up into a little ball. And he didn't get hurt, but it wasn't a practical thing. I never saw another one like it. How fast can a human being go on pedal power alone on the level with no wind? Well, there you have it. Sam Whittingham of Canada, 2008, 82.33 miles an hour with something that looks like a jet aircraft. It's a front-wheel drive, recumbent, and it is fast. That's Sam Whittingham. He's a Canadian Olympic team member. But this is ours, 44 miles an hour. That was the one we did first, and it's almost doubled since then. Every year now they have an international human-powered speed championship somewhere in the world. It's been going on continuously since 1975 when we first held it. Now for some for some simple little research projects which we did on bicycles, just to show you it's really a neat device. It's really a neat device. We wanted to know what was best, whether it was the supine, the prone, or the regular cycling position. So we actually measured it. This is an ergometer, which is a dynamometer for people, and we hooked the bicycle up to it. We had a more exotic form of it. We actually made a 200-pound flywheel and for part of this. Turns out that these are about the same. Human being is really adaptable. If they exercise in a position, turns out they can perform in the position better and better and better. They can almost take any position and exercise and put out aerobic capacity. So this is the best position. A few percent behind is this one, and that one is not quite as good. So we measured how powerful is a human being. Well, all you guys know this, but he's not an inconsiderable power source, a human being. Not really. That's watts. 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. By using an unbraked flywheel and just accelerating it from either from a dead stop or when it's spinning, accelerating it there, you find out for very short periods, the tenth of a second, 6 seconds, so on. For very short periods, this guy, and he's just a civil engineering student, he put out 1,900 watts. That's about 2.5 horsepower. For 6 seconds, he put out 1,300 watts, is 1.7 horsepower. That's pretty good for a civil engineering student. Now, I don't know whether Maude ever exercises you guys like that, but believe me, you guys could do just as well. I mean, this is an amateur bicycle rider here. In fact, what we did is we decided he could use a differential equation as well as anybody, and we started him accelerating an unbraked flywheel from 0, and he got up, this is Mario Palumbo, got up to 200 RPM, leg RPM almost. And his torque starts out at fairly high, and of course it goes down like that. And his power peaked at about 4 seconds and went down after that. So we said, how fast can Mario Palumbo cover 100 meters from a dead stop with a fixed gear, like with a track bike, one of your fixies that goes around with no brakes and anything like that? And he was able to predict it using a computer program, able to predict his speed, and this is not without cheating. He predicted his speed within 1/10 of a second, 9.3, 9.2, 9.4 seconds for 100 meters. Not bad. So anyway, that was a little project, was kind of fun. How do you measure rolling resistance? Well, Paul van Valkenburg, the guy with the funny fairing, gave him the project of trying to figure out what the rolling resistance of tires would be. So he built this tricycle, putting most of the weight, 100 and some odd pounds, on the front wheel, and measuring the rate at which it slows down, and it goes so slow, like 2 miles an hour, that wind resistance is not a factor you have to consider. and you can measure what the resistance of the tires would be. So we did that, measured all sorts of different tires, and this is a result of that thing. We changed the tire pressure, we changed the wheel size. It turns out that theory predicts that the smaller the wheel, the higher the rolling resistance, and the higher the pressure, the lower the rolling resistance. So you got some really neat information out of this. In 1996, for the U.S. cycling team, General Motors let us borrow their exotic tire testing machines. This one is a drum, the 2-meter in diameter drum, and we tested bicycle tires on. Normally they're truck tires, automobile tires. They test them up to 100 and some odd miles an hour. We didn't quite want to go that fast, but we found out that sew-ups were truly better than and other things. The different wheel sizes were better. You want to know what the dynamics of tires are. This is a flat track tester, and you can turn the wheel, a steering angle, you can tilt the wheel, and you can apply any force you want to on it. So it measures the side force, and so you can predict, with automobiles, you can predict what the response to cornering force is on this machine, and we did the same thing for tires on a bicycle. Couple really kind of interesting projects. Can you guys steer straight, do you think? Okay, you're bicycle racers, bicycle riders. You take off, and just exactly when you're pedaling, how much do you have to turn the wheel? Surprisingly, quite a bit. I think it's impossible to maintain a straight line, exactly straight line, when you're pedaling. So this is on a track, and we just put a little protractor there, and we had this guy, Carl Sundquist, Olympic rider, ride from a dead stop, and this is the angle. We put a television camera on it and ride from a dead stop as he pedaled. And it gets better the further down the track you go, and it goes to plus or minus 3 degrees or something like that when he's really set in the aero bars. But it's quite a bit. Starts out plus or minus 10 degrees and ends up plus or minus 5 for quite a long time. Well, the rolling resistance of a tire is a lot greater when you have a steering angle to it. So the smoother you could pedal, the faster you could go, the lower your rolling resistance. It's kind of an interesting project. Side winds and tailwinds are really quite important. If you have aero equipment, they sort of act like a sail. And you can develop lift from a disc wheel. So just going around a track, it turns out with very little wind, you can't avoid a yaw angle, which is that. If you have the bicycle speed there, the environmental wind speed like that, you have relative wind angle on a bicycle, which is that, and that's a yaw angle. And with aero equipment functions a lot better than standard equipment, so you can go faster sometimes with wind than without wind. And when you go around a track, no matter what you do, you're going to have about 5 degrees of yaw angle just because you go around the track and you have to turn to go around the track. We just put, in this case, a bit of cassette tape, hooked it to this, and this is a protractor, and we put a TV camera up here and took pictures of the protractor. All this is cheap research, but it gives you data that nobody else had ever done before, which is, I thought, kind of neat. And once again, this is all due to clever students. The efficiency of transmissions. I built this for the Olympic Committee. This is a dynamometer. It's a crank dynamometer where it has a force. You can tell what the torque is on the motor, and you can tell therefore, knowing the RPM, you can figure what the power input to this, and you have a transmission in between, and then you take a dynamometer or an ergometer wheel on the back end of it, and you can, at various loads and various RPMs and so on, you can tell how a transmission performs. You know the power in and the power out. You might imagine that the heavier the load, that the more efficient it would be, and that's true. This is just average data. A bicycle transmission is a very, very efficient way of transmitting power. It's just a chain drive. It's upwards of 98% efficient when it's loaded. And at very low loads, like 50 to 80 watts, which is typical of an average bike rider, it's still 94% efficient. So you don't really lose much power in a bicycle transmission. What's really fascinating, this is a 27-speed Shimano. What's really fascinating is every time you change gears, the efficiency changes. And it changes because the gear size is different, because the angle of the chain is different, because of a lot of things. Efficiency doesn't like really small gears like 10, 11, or 12-tooth gears. They're not very efficient. So if you want to go fast, you really should use a slightly bigger gear to get the same gear ratio. And it makes a difference. I mean, look here. There's about a 2 to 4% difference between here and here, isn't there? So if you chose a different gear ratio when you're doing a time trial, and you knew what the efficiency was, you could go faster. So that was kind of data that we didn't expect, and that was kind of useful. In 1982, anybody here heard of Ed Burke? He knows who Ed Burke is. Ed Burke was an inveterate author of bicycle books, technical bicycle books, and he was working for the Olympic Committee, so he asked me if there's anything I could do to improve the performance of a bicycle in 1982. And so I said, well, gee, the best thing to do is make it more streamlined so it has a lower wind resistance. So for the 1984 Olympics, this is Don Guichard. He's now chief engineer for Cervelo bicycles. He's a composites expert. And he entered our first, by the way, our second human-powered vehicle race. I knew him from a long time ago. He built the first Kevlar wheel. This is the lightest and the best disc wheel ever built. I swear it is. It weighs 500 grams. It's got a carbon rim. It's a tension membrane Kevlar surface. It's light, it's strong, and it has a low drag. It's really a beautiful wheel. That's Don Guichard's wheel. And we built a prototype bicycle which had two 24-inch wheels on it and oval tubing and so on. That was a prototype bicycle for 1984 Olympics. My wife Joyce, who is in the audience, raise your hand, Joyce. Joyce figured the best way to lower wind resistance is the human body. Is after all is 2/3 of the drag of a bicycle combination. So she made a really neat, tight skin suit, specially fit to each one of the U.S. team members, and it had a hood which covered up the chin cavity, which lowered the drag. It's really a neat invention. What do you suppose the UCI did about this? The minute they saw it, that's illegal. So, oh well, poor Joyce. She didn't get her uniforms in the Olympics, but she did in the Pan American Games. She made all the uniforms for the U.S. cycling team in the Pan American Games. Anyway, their normal response, we've had our equipment banned 12 times that we made for the USA Olympic team. 12 times. I mean, wheels, all sorts of stuff. So in 1984, the U.S. team had not taken a medal. They took a bronze medal in 1912 in cycling. It hadn't won another medal since then. Well, the Germans weren't there, East Germans, and the Soviets weren't there, but everybody else was there. The French, the Italians, the Germans, the English, all the other standard cycling teams were there. And they ended up taking 12 medals. This is Steve Haig, and this was called our racing system. We had Paul van Valkenburg made a helmet, Don Guichard made the wheels, I made the cranks, that's a disc sprocket, the shoe covers, Joyce actually made the first ones. Anyway, he won a gold medal in that, and we really did well in the '84 Olympics. It was a real revelation. So the first of the funny bikes and the real aero bikes appeared in 1984. The Italians had them, and we had them. guy named Antonio Del Monte made a funny bike for the Italians with disc wheels. So we were the only two, and the Italians did well, and we did well in the '84 Olympics. Up in my attic these are prototypes we built for the '84 Olympics. That's got two 18-inch wheels. This is a 24-18. This is the prototype bike I showed you, and this was a prototype road bike with 700C 24-inch wheel that has aero bars on it and everything. That was a little 1986. We built this one. So I pulled them down and shoved them into a snowbank because they could stand up like they had and we took a picture of what's in my attic now. However, the most unusual thing I've done recently was due to this curve right here. We took a leg model and we stuck it in a wind tunnel. We put hair on the leg and measured it without hair and with hair, and believe me, it's better to shave your legs. That's all I can tell you. So we proved that these idiots that shave their legs so they look kind of strange, they're right. The drag is less. And we put different socks. Joyce made the socks, and put different socks, different materials, cotton, wool, all sorts of stuff. And we measured them in the wind tunnel at Cal State Long Beach. You have a really small wind tunnel. And all of a sudden, one of these things just dropped just like that. Really strange. We didn't believe it. But when you think about it, if you take a cylinder, if you have laminar flow on the head end of the cylinder, it'll separate at the widest point. And you get a tremendous base area and base drag. And if you put a tripwire here, which Prondl did and others, put a tripwire there which causes turbulent flow, it becomes far more active, the turbulence, and it'll stick to the profile, and you'll have a much smaller wake. The drag between here and here, it drops from about 1.2 to 0.3 or 0.4. It's a tremendous way of decreasing the drag. Well, it turns out the human being, of course, is a series of cylinders. And so we actually published this data in the Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. Published this data, and Nike read it. An engineer from Nike, Eddie Harbour, a designer, and Rick McDonald, read it, and they decided, well, gee, maybe we could make use of that. So my friend Len Brownlee of Canada had done a PhD on this, on the drag of materials and uniforms and clothing. So Nike got Brownlee and myself involved in it, and we designed runners' uniforms. Kathy Freeman wore one of our suits in 2000 to win the 400 meters. Whether it did any good or not, I can't say, but she did win. However, in speed skating, the results were absolutely spectacular, just unbelievable. It depends on the size of the cylinder, what roughness you need to cause the drag crisis, to cause this to drop like that. What you want is that every part of the human body that's exposed to the air, you would like it to drop at the same time and continue all during the racing regime, right there. So what we did is we took, for speed skaters, we took different material on the arms and on the thighs and on the lower leg. We took material that would cause the flow to go through the drag crisis more or less at the same time and maintain a low drag. And it was embarrassing, actually. The Dutch had these suits, the Americans had the suits, and the Australians had the suits. And the Dutch were really skeptical. I mean, they're old-time speed skaters. They used Spider and Descent, other clothing. They were skeptical. They said, this stuff is not going to work. So we said, well, why don't you try it? this has actually happened. Why don't you try it? And so the guy came back next week after he gave these suits to the skaters. He said, well, this is Salt Lake City. He said, well, either their condition is improved by 20% or your suits are working. They were a second faster per lap than Descent and Spider and the other type clothing that the skaters wore. So as a matter of fact, in 2002, for the Salt Lake City Olympics, every one of the long track gold medalists wore Nike's suit. They call it a Swift suit. And they won like 17 out of 24 medals overall. Well, it was kind of neat. That was a roaring success for Aerodynamics. So we transferred our efforts to cycling and developed a Swift suit for cyclists. This is Lance Armstrong trying out one of the suits, and we went through several prototypes. And I quit Nike, well, I stopped working with Nike in 2004, but by that time they had won the Tour de France and the World Championship and a whole bunch of other things by wearing the Swift suit, which decreases the drag, by the way, by 5% per rider. So it really worked well. One thing Nike does is they've got a graphics department that won't quit, and so if they're going to do a storyboard or a presentation to the management, they always do a beautiful graphic design. This was a one material suit. That was the first one we did. And so there's Brownlee, Rick McDonald, Brownlee, and myself. And that's our model, trying it out, and there are guys wearing it. But anyway, the graphics are kind of neat for Nike. Did the same thing in '96 for the team, only this time everybody had super bikes, everybody had fast bikes, everybody had carbon bikes, everybody had aero helmets, everybody had good clothing. And so we didn't do so well in '96, but we built some neat bicycles, and it was kind of fun. But Colonelli, this is an Italian bike, you can see what their bikes were really good, really neat. He's using the Superman position, which we recommended to the U.S. team, but being a little more conventional, they used this. This guy broke the world record with using the Superman position. So '96 wasn't such a success, but we did work a long time and pretty hard on it. Go into a couple other things. I tell you, if you stick around long enough, you meet a lot of people and you get to do a lot of fun things. Paul McCready was our first timer for the human-powered vehicle race. That's his son, Taylor. That's Taylor. That's his son, Taylor. The people that first started to design the bikes in 1983, that's Paul McCready. Alan Abbott is the high-speed cyclist. This is, I got to go through these names just to show you the strange people that show up at races. This is Alec Brooks. Alec Brooks designed the EV1 for the GM and designed the solar car, the Sun Racer. Don Gauchard, the wheels, and he's chief engineer for Cervelo now. Paul Van Valkenburg was a race car engineer for GM and also went to Cal State Long Beach. He designed the helmet. I've got a disc sprocket there. This is Jack Lambie, who reinstituted the sport of hang gliding, built a model of Wright Brothers' first flyer. He built a model of Curtis's flyer, which his brother crashed. Anyway, you meet some strange people at these races, I'll tell you. McCready decided he'd try to win the Kramer Prize. So he built the lightest and most gossamer form of an aircraft you could possibly imagine. It used, there's a stanchion here, and there are wires going out to the wing to support it. It had a very crude cockpit where the rider would pedal like this and go up to a drive shaft which operated the propeller. So his first attempts to win the Kramer Prize were not very successful. They got this off the ground. It did fly, but it just took too much energy. So finally, when they won the Kramer Prize, they did it with they had a complete streamlined enclosure for the racer. They had a two-element airfoil, I mean a two-surface airfoil, an efficient wing. The way they got it to turn finally was to use a wing that out in front, and so they had to go over a 10-foot barrier to begin with, fly a figure-8 course, and then go over a 10-foot barrier at the end. And this is him winning the Kramer Prize, $150,000. That's Brian Allen, who is a pilot and a bicycle racer. Well, the only thing I did was recommend that they use this position. I knew it wasn't much worse than the cycling position. But anybody who took part in the project got to fly the Gossamer Condor. The canard wing and the configuration of this made it very easy to fly. Their grandmothers flew it. 12-year-olds flew it. All of the guys that took part in the project flew it a week later at Shafter Airport Base. One thing that happened is this. His aerodynamicist, who's a Caltech professor named Peter Lisseman, designed the wing. He weighed 183 pounds. I weighed 170. Jack Lambie flew it. He weighed about 170. And Lisseman climbed in. He was the last guy. I think McCready knew about this. He was the last guy to climb in and fly it. It got off the ground and flew, and all of a sudden a tremendous snap. I was on my bicycle following this. This is Paul McCready here. And bang, down it comes. It crashed. So you know what his response to this was? This is a lesson to you engineers, how to react in an emergency. McCready has his hand on his chin right there. He's thinking. And he says, he says, see, we built it for Brian Allen. 1.1 safety factor. He weighs 160. That's about 178. Well, it should have broken, he said. That was it. 2 hours later, they had it flying again. I mean, it was such a simple construction that they put it back together and it was flying about 2 hours later. As I said, you get to do some funny things. I would like to show you a picture of Joyce, my wife Joyce. There she is right there. This is on a Honda pedal-powered float with Paul McCready as the captain of the float. And there, let's see, Joyce is there, the Alan Abbotts are there, Alec Brooks is there, and all the rest of the people that we knew. And we pedaled down Colorado Boulevard in the Rose Parade. Get to do a lot of fun stuff. Well, anyway, the most exciting thing possibly that could happen is to go to Australia and with the solar car. I got to desire the wheels, the tires, and the brakes for the solar car, the Sun Racer, and it won by traveling from Darwin to Adelaide. Won by a whole day over its nearest rival. Here it is coming down the middle of the outback, the red center they call it, the middle of the outback from north to south in Australia. And that was lots of fun. Joyce and I followed the race in a Honda motor van, and we got to see the whole thing. However, the thing that was the most fun we ever did, has anybody ever traveled from the westernmost point of Australia to the easternmost point, right through the middle of the outback at 12 to 15 miles an hour? Oh, this is the Great Australian Bike Race. It's a mountain bike race. 50 people showed up from all over the world for this race, from Germany, France, Switzerland, England, United States. And they raced from early morning, this is dawn, early morning to late at night, right through the middle of the outback. The Gun Barrel Highway had been graded 11 years before that. There was mud, there was sand, it was tough. It was really tough. And so when they finally got to the other side of Australia, of the 50 that started, there were 4 left. 4. We went through Crocodile, Dundee territory. That's a Midland hotel where they take beer bottles and throw them out the back door. And you have all these characters, funny-looking characters. That's a drover from Australia. He's got a hat on that's sweat-stained and torn. I was sitting next to him, and I asked him, hey, I said, that's a kind of worn-looking hat. How old is that hat? He says, mate, he says, that's me new hat, 6 months. So, had road trains. The road trains are 3 trailers long. They're 180 feet long, a road train. They go 70 miles an hour right down a dirt road. The dust rises 200 feet in the air. It scares the hell out of you, I'm telling you. You go through territory like this Ayers Rock is over here somewhere. Those are the Olgas. Well, they got to the other end of the race, and that's the lighthouse at Byron Bay, and that was 3,000 miles later. 4 people finished. That's one of the guys that finished. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate it. I think in view of the time, perhaps we should let people who have questions come up and ask Chet. First
Yeah, sorry to keep you afterwards.
Not at all. Not at all. But thanks a lot.
Okay.